I grew up in the middle of a small rural town, 1,000 people approximately in the town, and I lived right smack dab in the middle of the town, right by Main Street. It was probably after he was over here as an exchange student for about 3-4 months.
More than that.
He actually was around Christmas time, I think.
She has been on your television screen for more than a decade, standing quietly next to one of the most recognized veterinarians in America. Most viewers know her as the calm woman at the front desk, the one who keeps the phones ringing and the appointment book full while her husband treats everything from house cats to horses. But almost nobody talks about what Diane Pol actually lived through to get there: a childhood on a small Michigan farm, a love story carried across an ocean for 5 years by nothing but letters, a marriage that began in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language, and a family built entirely through adoption because biology never gave her the children she wanted. And buried inside all of that is real grief, the kind the cameras never lingered on, the kind her family still refuses to explain in detail out of respect for the people they lost. Today we're going to walk through the real story of Diane Pol, separate the facts from the rumors that have spread about her online, and look honestly at the loss that actually shaped her life. Diane Dalrymple was born on February 6, 1943, in Mayville, Michigan, a small farming town in the state's Thumb region. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the rhythm of the seasons decided when you planted, when you harvested, and when winter finally let go. She grew up around animals the way most kids grow up around a television. Dogs, cats, rabbits, poultry, and farm livestock was simply part of daily life. That early exposure to animals would end up shaping the entire second half of her life, even though nobody could have predicted it at the time. In the fall of 1961, as Diane was heading into her senior year of high school, her family agreed to host a foreign exchange student. On August 17th of that year, she and her parents drove to Detroit to pick up an 18-year-old boy from a small village in the Netherlands. His name was Jan Pol, and he had grown up on a Dutch dairy farm in a country still rebuilding after the devastation of the Second World War. When he stepped off the plane and saw the tall American girl waiting for him, the moment that stuck with both of them for the rest of their lives was almost comically simple. He was struck by how tall she was. That was the entire beginning of a love story that would eventually last more than half a century. For the first several months, there was nothing romantic about their relationship at all. Jan lived with Diane's family, attended the local high school, and worked on learning English while adjusting to an entirely new culture. Diane, meanwhile, was simply the girl driving the exchange student around town. It wasn't until around the Christmas season of that year, after Jan had been in the country for 3 or 4 months, that something between them started to shift. By the time the school year ended in the summer of 1962, Jan returned home to the Netherlands. On paper, that should have been the end of it. Exchange students go home. Host families move on. Most of these connections fade within a year. Instead, Diane and Jan began writing to each other. And they kept writing for 5 years. This wasn't a relationship built on texting or video calls. There was no email, no cheap long-distance calling, nothing but paper, ink, and the patience to wait weeks for a reply to cross the Atlantic Ocean. During those 5 years, Diane finished high school, went on to college, and started building her adult life in Michigan, all while staying emotionally tied to a young man she had known for less than a year, living on another continent. There was no way to know, day to day, whether the relationship would ever become anything permanent. She simply kept writing, and so did he. Think about what those 5 years of letters actually required. Every thought had to be written down carefully, because there was no way to immediately clarify a misunderstanding or soften a poorly worded sentence with a quick phone call. A question sent from Michigan might not get an answer for weeks. A photograph only arrived when someone bothered to slip one into an envelope before sealing it. There was no way for Diane to simply picture Jan's face whenever she wanted to. She had to hold on to the memory of one school year and trust that it was enough to build a future on. Meanwhile, the expected path for a young woman in a small farming town like Mayville was fairly narrow. Marry someone local, stay close to family, build a quiet life within a few miles of where you grew up. Diane didn't follow that script. Part of her stayed tied to a young man on the other side of the Atlantic, and she kept choosing him, letter after letter, for half a decade, without any guarantee that it would ever lead anywhere. In 1967, Diane and Jan got married. She was 24. He was 25. And rather than settling into small-town Michigan life the way most of her peers were doing, Diane made the far harder choice. She moved to the Netherlands to be with her new husband while he finished veterinary school at Utrecht University. This is a part of the story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Diane didn't simply follow her husband overseas and wait around. She went to work as an elementary school teacher in a country where she hadn't grown up speaking the language, supporting the household financially while Jan worked toward a demanding veterinary degree that wouldn't be finished until 1970. Picture that for a moment, a young woman in her mid-20s, thousands of miles from her parents, teaching children in a foreign school system, managing a home in a country with no family history for her. Also, her husband could become the veterinarian who would one day become a household name in the United States. Phone calls back to Michigan were too expensive to use casually. Letters were still the primary way she kept in touch with the people she'd left behind. She carried that entire chapter of her life quietly, without complaint, for years. After Jan graduated in 1970, the couple moved back to the United States in 1971 and settled in Harbor Beach, Michigan, where Jan took a position working for an established local veterinarian. He would stay in that job for more than a decade before ever starting anything of his own. During those years, Diane kept teaching, first in Harbor Beach, and she also continued her own education, eventually earning a master's degree in special reading from Michigan State University. That degree meant she had trained specifically to work with children who struggled to read, learning how to be patient with kids who needed more time and more support than the average classroom could offer. It's worth pausing on that, because it tells you something about who Diane Pol actually was before any of this became a television show. Long before she was known as Doc's wife, she was a trained reading specialist who spent her days helping struggling children catch up. In 1981, after more than 10 years of Jan working for someone else, the couple finally took the leap and started their own veterinary practice. They didn't open in a proper building. They started it in the garage on their own property in Weidman, Michigan, a rural community with only a few hundred residents at the time. And from that very first day, the roles were clear. Jan handled the animals. Diane handled everything else, and everything else turned out to be an enormous job. She managed the appointment book, billing, payroll, tax filings, staffing, and client relationships. In a rural veterinary practice, that also meant handling emergency phone calls in the middle of the night and making hard calls about which farming families could be given more time to pay their bills. Rural vet clinics don't operate like city businesses. When a dairy farm has a bad year, the vet bill is often the first thing that goes unpaid, but the sick animals still need treatment and the farmer still has to call. Someone has to decide how to balance compassion with keeping the lights on, and for more than 4 decades in Weidman, Michigan, that someone was Diane Pol. Over the following decades, the small garage practice grew into Pol Veterinary Services, eventually treating hundreds of thousands of animals and employing a full team of staff. Diane has been publicly described by her own family as Jan's right hand, not a supporting character in his story, but a genuine co-founder of the business that would one day become the backdrop for one of the most watched shows on its network. It's easy to overlook just how demanding that kind of work actually is when you only see it summarized in a sentence or two. Running the office for a rural veterinary practice means being the first voice a panicked farmer hears at 3 in the morning when a calf isn't coming out right. It means keeping track of which clients are a month behind on payment because their crop didn't sell well that year, and deciding how long the clinic can afford to wait before it has to draw a hard line. It means managing a growing staff, keeping the tax filings in order, coordinating a schedule that never really has a slow season, and doing all of it while also raising 3 children. None of that shows up in a 30-second highlight reel, but it's the actual machinery that kept a 2-person garage operation running long enough to eventually become a nationally known clinic. Life in Weidman during those years wasn't glamorous. It was long hours, unpredictable emergencies, and a level of responsibility to the surrounding farming community that went well beyond simply running a business. When your clinic is one of the only options for miles, the decisions you make about who gets seen and who gets billing flexibility ripple out into real families and real livelihoods. Diane carried a large share of that responsibility for more than 4 decades, largely out of the public eye, long before any of it was considered interesting enough to put on television. Alongside building that business, Jan and Diane built a family, but not in the way most couples do. All 3 of their children came into their lives through adoption. Kathy and Charles were both adopted as infants. Their 3rd child, known as Diane Jr., came into the family differently. She was their foster child for 10 years before they formally adopted her, and the adoption happened when she was already 18 years old. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. By the time she turned 18, there was no legal requirement forcing the family to stay connected. The state's involvement in the fostering arrangement had already ended. Jan and Diane didn't have to adopt her at that point. They chose to, specifically so the relationship they had built over a decade would become permanent and legally binding for the rest of their lives. That single decision says more about the kind of people Jan and Diane Pol are than almost anything that ever aired on television. By the time their children were grown, the Pol family looked, from the outside, like a fairly ordinary rural Michigan household. Busy, close-knit, and entirely defined by work. Charles, one of their adopted sons, would go on to become deeply involved in the family business in a completely different way than either of his parents expected. Years later, he became a producer on the very television series that turned his family's clinic into a household name, and is often credited as one of the main reasons the show existed in the first place. Kathy, their other adopted child, built her own family life in Michigan, working and raising her children while staying closely connected to her parents and the clinic. Their youngest, Diane Jr., grew into an adult who remained active in animal care and farm life, carrying forward the same hands-on, practical approach to work that defined her parents. None of the three children were born into the family biologically, and yet the family they built together was, by every meaningful measure, entirely real, shaped by choice rather than chance. The show that eventually made this family recognizable across the country, The Incredible Dr. Pol, premiered on Nat Geo Wild on October 29, 2011. Diane was 68 years old when it began, not a young woman chasing fame, but someone who had already lived a full, demanding working life long before a camera crew ever walked into the clinic. The series went on to run for 24 seasons and became one of the most watched programs on its network for the better part of a decade, before National Geographic announced in the summer of 2024 that it was coming to an end. That level of national attention changed the daily reality of a small-town veterinary clinic. What had once served farms and families within Isabella County suddenly started fielding calls from clients across the entire country. People drove for hours just to bring their animals to the clinic they'd seen on television. And behind every single one of those visits was paperwork, scheduling, billing, and coordination, all of which still ran through Diane, now well into her 70s. Fame also brought public scrutiny, and any honest retelling of this family's story has to include it. In 2014, the state licensing board in Michigan took disciplinary action against Jan Pol following a case involving a dog that had been struck by a car, citing findings of negligence.